Well, as they say, the Spain campaign is plainly on the wane. All right, forgive me, I've been waiting a long time to say that. So this episode here is in some ways the end of my Spanish series in Medieval Total War, which I started a little while ago, and the goal of which was to uncover information about the inheritance mechanic in this game, the original Medieval Total War released in 2002. So far, I've only managed to inherit territory from another faction a single time, and it wasn't while I was playing as the Spanish, but I wanted to give the Spanish a try because they seemed to be in a pretty good position, potentially, to inherit from another faction. They've got access to some special inquisitors. They have a very nice economy, so you can quickly afford to focus on agents and use assassins to take out your rivals. And so if you've followed that series, you'll know that that's what I did. There were very few battles. I played a very peaceful campaign in the sense of not attacking hardly anybody. And you'll notice, let's see, the current year is 1330. I've got 826,000 florins in the bank. And it's a bit later in the campaign than the last episode in the series, but I'm calling it here because really everything that occurred after the last episode that I uploaded was just more of the same. I was just clicking end turn, waiting for the AI to send princesses to me, and it was not complying. Now, there would appear, if you're new to this mechanic, there would appear to be two ways, potentially, to inherit land from an AI faction. One is by finding a foreign princess and dropping an emissary on her and requesting that she marry into your family. Now, I'm not sure if there's any actual princesses on the map at the moment. I've been pretty aggressive. Okay, there's a German right here. And so we'll get my emissary and we'll just show you what that message looks like, because maybe you didn't watch that series. Do you wish to request this princess marries into your faction? If her faction is eliminated, you may gain some claim to their lands. If you say yes, and if the faction agrees, the idea is that that princess gives you a claim to her faction's territory if this faction is eliminated. Now, the game is not very clear about what they mean by that, and I'm not very clear about whether that method that I just described actually works, because although I have inherited once from another faction, it was not by asking a princess to marry into my family. It was by having a princess of another faction offer herself to me. And that is how I inherited while playing as the Scots. So one way to do it is to take the initiative, ask that the princess marry into your family. The other is just to wait. And at a certain point in the game, you get a lot fewer of those offers than you do in the beginning. Alliance blocks kind of emerge, and factions disappear over time. Other factions emerge, and there's not that many factions left on the map right now, as you can see. And out of these 7 other factions, there are 2 who we couldn't inherit from at all, right? Because they're Muslims, they don't have princesses. And there's one, the Germans, which I'm not sure if we could really inherit from because of the special way their faction works. The Germans have an empire, a Holy Roman Empire, and so when all of their nobles of royal blood are killed, they still elect a new emperor. And so I'm not sure how that is supposed to interact with the inheritance mechanic. So I'm basically just showing you where I am at the end date. It's a very interesting campaign. I mean, the Pope is still around, and they're kind of going nuts, which is very interesting to see. But because the campaign's purpose was not really to play like I would normally play, but just to sort of do the bare minimum so that I could continue to live and keep trying to inherit, I didn't really see much point in continuing. So I'm going to call it here. But, well, what I also wanted to do in this video was talk a little bit about some more information I recently discovered that is going to give me some more things to think about with regard to inheritance. So what I'm looking at here is a thread on twcenter.net. Now, for those of you of a certain age, you may remember this as a forum. Forums used to be places where people would meet to discuss things like video games until Discord emerged and destroyed all of that, essentially, or social media, whatever you want to call it. But forums are great because they were depositories for information that lasted a bit longer than they do in sites like Discord or social media. It just became a place where, because it was more of a post-type format, people would tend to be a bit more slow, perhaps, more thorough to respond sometimes. You could have more focused conversations that were a bit easier to follow, potentially. And information tended to stick around a little bit more. With the slow death of forums, though, this has all changed, and so I don't often jump onto twcenter.net. However, when was this? This was posted by a user called Welder2 back in December 24th of 2024, so about 6-7 months from the time of me recording this video. And I only saw it like within the past week or so, and it's given me a lot to think about. I do not know Welder2, but he seems to be someone who has acquired some special knowledge of the inner workings of medieval Total War. What he seems to be revealing is the hard-coded stuff. That is, these are things that you or I cannot easily access by jumping into the game files. If you go into the files, the folder where you've installed Medieval Total War, you can find certain files that you can open up and just read because they're like in Notepad or something. It's just a very easy text file to understand. But a lot of information in the game is not accessible there. So I do not know exactly how Welder2 came about this information. I do not know if this information is accurate, but this is the only post that I have found that purports to describe precisely what happens with inheritance in Medieval Total War. So I thought it might be interesting for us to read this through together. I don't think that many people have seen this. There's got to be, I think, a place for the views at the bottom. Nope, it doesn't tell me how many views it has, but I don't think it's that many, right? The forums are quite slow. I've sent a direct message to Welder2 a day or two ago. I've replied in this thread, and I'm hoping to get more information because I have lots of questions about this. But we can just kind of talk through this. So here's what he says. When a princess marries the leader, that is faction leader, or prince of another faction, her new faction will be able to inherit the provinces of the former faction. This happens if the former faction of the princess is left without princes after the death of the leader. All right, so already what I'm seeing here is a couple of things. In my Spanish campaign, I had, and when I inherited from the Scots, I had gradually sort of come to the suspicion that the method of acquiring a marriage could be very important to determining whether inheritance is possible. As we said, you can ask a princess to marry into your family, or you can wait for a princess to basically, you can wait for a foreign faction to present you with one of their princesses. The latter of those is the circumstance in which I have inherited in this game. So I'm wondering, do I need to wait until the AI sends me a princess? Welder never in this post specifies that. Never says, oh, it needs to be from an offer by the AI, right? It doesn't say anything like that. So maybe that is a non-factor. I still suspect it does matter based on some testing I've done since I read this over the past few days, but I'm not 100% on that. Here's the other thing that's interesting about this. I've noticed that in order to prevent an heir from the faction taking over when you assassinate all of the princes, you also have to keep an eye out for characters in that faction with the royal blood indicator. That is, characters with a little crown to the right of their portrait. And again, just what I've been doing here in testing in the Spanish campaign and other campaigns is building a stable of high valor assassins, getting basically up to 3-star assassins, training tons of them, getting a marriage somehow, and then eliminating that faction through assassination. What I've been trying to do is actually eliminate the faction, because sometimes you can kill the king, kill all the heirs, and then you have some other heir who just mysteriously appears. I think what's happening in that scenario is there is a family member or someone with royal blood. There's a general with royal blood in the family who's still kicking around. And the game will not alert you of this fact when you go to assassinate the king. If you've killed all the princes, the ones that would appear on the heir sheet in game, if there are some royal blood guys, like the uncles of the current king, who now are not like in line for the throne, if you go to assassinate the king, the message you will receive on queuing up that assassination will say something like, this king has no heirs and you'll eliminate his faction if you kill him. But if there are royal blood guys in the family, that will actually not be the case. That's an important distinction. I think we want to keep that in mind. What this is saying here is that you inherit only when you eliminate the princes. In other words, you don't need to, and maybe you don't want to, eliminate all of the royal blood members, because the royal blood members, they may be important for inheritance. We'll see when we get to the end of this. It says, if a new leader is chosen, in other words, for the HRE, the Germans, or the Vikings, or a general of royal blood becomes the new leader, then this does not cancel the right of inheritance. So there's a couple of big things here. And again, I do not know if this information is accurate. I'm just reporting what I'm seeing here from a guy who seems to know what he's talking about. If a new leader is chosen for HRE or Vikings, let's start here. So the Germans and the Vikings work essentially the same from what I understand. In other words, you cannot, through assassination, eliminate these factions. At best, what you can do is eliminate their royal family, right? All of the king and the heirs. And you can cause like a civil war by doing that, because there may be multiple claimants with the royal blood tag. And they may start up different factions, I guess. So, but the bigger point here is that the inheritance claim remains. One of the things that I had been concerned about in previous attempts to inherit was I thought that the king under whose reign the faction is eliminated matters. So let's say you get a marriage from a foreign princess. What I've been trying to do was kill all of the princess's brothers first and then kill her dad, right? And so that with her dad's death, the faction would die out. That's what kind of worked out with me when I did inherit the one time. The Northumbrians sent me a princess. I accepted. I killed all of the princes in that family and then killed the king and then inherited like all of Northumbria. It was awesome. But this is saying maybe you don't need to be focused on that. Maybe you don't need to worry about the transition of power passing through a couple of generations before you kill all of the royal family. We'll keep reading. This is obvious. The Muslim factions do not participate. They do not marry. They don't have princesses. That's pretty straightforward. If a new marriage is concluded between factions, the earlier date is overwritten. The more recent the date, the more likely the inheritance is. So, and he has a whole system that he's going to be talking about here. This is not random, according to him. There's no random chance. There is rather a point system that the game is tracking. So this is more complex, more complicated, more complex than I have been led to believe. It is in some ways more controllable by the player, which is wonderful news if this is true. Unfortunately, I've not been able yet to reproduce it using these methods. But this is interesting. If a new marriage is concluded, the earlier date is overwritten, and the later date is the one that takes precedence. So let's say that a faction sends me a princess and I agree, and then a couple of years, decades down the road, I've got a new heir who needs to marry somebody and I request a princess. I guess what this means is that the more recent date is the one that we'll be counting from, okay? Regardless, what he's saying here is there is a date and the date matters. Okay, interesting here. The possibility of inheritance remains until the end of the game. Marriage dates are not reset for eliminated or reappearing factions. So in other words, he's saying that if I wipe out a faction and that faction later reemerges, that marriage that I had with the faction in its previous life is still being tracked. So there's a possibility that I might not inherit from the faction in its first life. Let's say I make a marriage alliance with the French and the Germans come and wipe them out. but the French reemerge, there's a possibility that after their reemergence, I might be able to inherit from them, according to this. I've never seen that. That's not how it went in the one time it's worked for me, but it could be that the odds are just really low, or the criteria are very high. So we'll move on. Okay. Provinces are transferred to the new owner along with armies and agents, and this is pretty consistent with what I've seen. The one time I inherited, you can check out in my video where I show you the aftermath of it. I got all of the provinces. I got all of the armies. I didn't see agents. I've got to admit, I'll go back and check my video there, but I don't believe there were any agents kicking around that I inherited from the Northumbrians. But absolutely, I got their armies, and I got their provinces. This is interesting, the possibility that you might inherit an agent that you shouldn't normally get. So, like, theoretically, if you're playing on the map of Europe, the big campaign, you might inherit land from the Byzantines when you're playing a Catholic faction, and maybe you get one of their Orthodox priests, right? So that's an interesting quirk. I've, again, never seen that. You don't inherit fleets. You don't get crusades. You wouldn't get jihads anyway because you don't inherit from the Muslim factions. Besieged castles and foreign provinces go to the rebels, even if the faction does not die. So in other words, if you've inherited from a faction, but one of that faction's settlements are under siege, that settlement is not going to go to you. It's going to go to the rebels. The rebels will be besieged, right? That's how that's going to work. If the candidate faction, this is really important. If the candidate faction has the largest annual income or the largest army or the largest number of glory points, then it is excluded from the list of candidates. In other words, you cannot inherit if you're making the most money. You cannot inherit if you have the biggest army. You cannot inherit if you are winning glorious achievements, if you have the most points in the glorious achievements mode. This right here is, assuming again this is correct, this is probably one of the big reasons that you don't see this. Because in order to inherit, you need to kind of be losing the game a little bit, right? In my Spanish campaign, I am pretty sure that I got the notification of having the largest income, especially towards the end when I got my trade fleets all over the map. That's what's going to happen. Now, he makes a distinction here, not profit. When you look in your economy tab, you can see that there is the income, and then there is the expenses, and then there is a separate line for the profit, right? Like what are you actually expected to make? What is the net? He's talking here about the largest annual income, and I believe that this is what is referenced with the in-game messages. You get messages it seems to be every 8 years, about which faction has the largest annual income, which faction is the strongest, in other words, has the largest military forces. You get a message about which faction's population is the happiest, and you get a message about which faction is the most advanced. How many buildings and upgrades do they have in their kingdom is what that must refer to. The only two that matter for this purpose are income and army strength. So if you're winning on income, if you're making the most money, if you've got a massive trading empire, you can't inherit. If you have the biggest military in the world, you can't inherit. So I had been thinking about trying this again with the Byzantines, right? Because the Byzantines are a fun game. Byzantines on early. And then, just kind of sitting in my home provinces and making a ton of money, getting a bunch of agents out there. But if I do that, I would have to be careful to not make as much money as I possibly can, right? And I'd have to be careful not to train as many troops as I possibly can, because that's going to disqualify me. So and you can't win. You can't win glorious achievements. So this is actually a big problem for if you want to try this as the Russians, I think, because they get ridiculous amounts of points on GA mode. So just kind of keep that in mind. I've tried some test campaigns with various factions, and so far it's actually not been too hard to avoid making the most money and getting the biggest army. So it's doable, but I think that most of the time people aren't thinking to try to inherit stuff, and they're certainly not going to kneecap their economy to do it or to short their army to do it. So this could be disqualifying people a lot. Okay. Here's some other things that are disqualified. Provinces in which the new leader and his rival in the civil war are located cannot be inherited. So what he's describing here is when you quote unquote eliminate a faction, and that results, so you've eliminated the princes, you've eliminated the king or the faction leader. That results in, if there are generals of royal blood, if there are at least 2 generals with royal blood, who are, again, not the princes, then there will be a civil war. And so if you have a, let's say you've got a really small faction that's come under pressure, they're weak, and you think that, okay, they send you a princess, you think, awesome. The problem is, you may not have enough time to avoid this scenario if they're getting attacked by a stronger faction, because there may only be 2 provinces left to them, right? So, in other words, this disqualifies potentially 2 provinces from any faction that you're trying to inherit from. The province where the new leader, the new king of the faction, will emerge, and the province in which the leader of the opposing rebels in the Civil War will emerge. I think you can kind of guess where those provinces are likely to be, because if you're tracking all of this, if you've got agents in all of their provinces, you'll know, okay, where is the guy with royal blood and where's the other guy with royal blood? And you can just try to make sure that you're going to inherit a province that is not in either of those places. Again, assuming this works out. All right, so now let's get to the meat of this, which is the point system that he's saying, Welder 2 here is saying is required to inherit provinces. This is what he says, this is province by province. Now, this is surprising to me, because in the one occasion in which I inherited territory, it was like, I think it was just about the whole thing of the Northumbrians' lands. I think I inherited just about all of their provinces, with maybe the exception of one. And I'm not sure, again, how that occurred. But here's what we've got. Points are calculated separately for each province. And to inherit a province, you have to score a certain number of points, and you've got to get more points than any other candidates, any other factions who may have married into this faction, right? Who may also be inheriting. So here's the calculations. Here's the pluses and the minuses. You're trying to get lots of the pluses lined up. So the first one is that you add the number of years that the candidate faction, i.e. you, if you're trying to inherit, the number of years that you owned the province. So let's say, again, you're trying to inherit from the French. Let's imagine it's the early game, right? The early period. And the French start with what? They get Brittany, they get Toulouse, they get Ile-de-France, Champagne, and Flanders, right? I think that's pretty much all they start off with in early. When, let's say you're playing the English, okay, you don't own any of those provinces, right? So let's say that somehow you've eliminated the French, and that's what they've owned since the beginning of the game, and you've owned your homeland since the beginning of the game. So I assume that this means you get plus 0 points, right? But let's say, for the sake of argument, that you, as the English, conquered Flanders from the French. Okay, and you owned it for like 5 years. So now this value, instead of being 0, the value for Flanders is going to be 5. Increases by 1 for each year of ownership of the province. Okay? Now, this part I don't quite follow, and I'm not sure what Welder 2 is saying here. Otherwise, this value decreases by 1. How would it be decreasing by 1? If you don't own it, does this value decrease by 1? So in other words, you may start off with a big negative here in terms of calculating your points. So, but it can't be less than 1? So in other words, okay, how about this? I think maybe what this means is, if I owned Flanders for 5 years, but I lost it 5 years ago, right? And the French took it, let's say I lost it 5 years ago to the Germans, but the French moved in and took it back, and now I've eliminated the French, and the game is trying to figure out, do I get Flanders back? I would get 5 points for having owned Flanders, but does this mean that it would decrease by 1 for each year? So then I don't get anything, right? Because if it's been 5 years, the 5 points that I've accumulated for the 5 years that I've owned it would now be canceled out. So I think that's what he's trying to say here. But it would not be less than 1. So if I owned it at all ever, I would get at least 1 point. And I cannot get a point value greater than 24 for this calculation. I think this part means that at the start of the campaign, you're considered to have 20 points for the provinces that you begin with. So let's say that, again, I'm playing the English, and we're considering the province of Wessex. Let's say that the French conquered it from me, like, at the beginning of the campaign, right? And we later made peace, but they still kept Wessex. And then I eliminated them through assassination, and now the game is trying to figure out, do I inherit Wessex? Well, Wessex counts as 20 for me because I owned it at the start of the campaign. Now, if I lost it a bunch of years ago, does that mean that it goes down by 1 that many times? Maybe. And maybe that means that I could get only 1 point towards inheriting Wessex, according to this. Not totally sure. What this seems to suggest, though, is that there's going to be some range of point values between 1 and between 24, at which values you can assign to provinces that you have owned. Most of the time, I think this is not going to be the deciding factor according to the other values that we can see here. Here is the big one, and the big surprise to me, and I hope it's true, but I suspect that it's not. Or I suspect that there's something else going on there. The number of any agents of the candidate faction, i.e. you, in the province, times 10, right? That asterisk means times, is that right? Times 10. So that means if I've got 10 bishops in a province that I'm trying to inherit, that counts as 100 points. I only need 40 to inherit, right? As we'll see in a minute here. So that means theoretically I only need 4 agents in a province, and I may not even need that many. When I did inherit playing as the Scots, I did not have a ton of agents in the province of the Northumbrians. I had maybe an odd bishop or emissary around there because I was trying to keep an eye on them. I did have maybe 6 assassins in some of their provinces. That would have been 60 points, I guess. But it wasn't a ton. And I have since reading this, I have tried several campaigns, just really quick, rushing through to get assassins, to get marriages, to test this out. And I could pile like 20 bishops into a province and end up not getting it. So again, I think there's either something else here, or this is wrong, or there's a typo or something. But if this is true, a couple of questions. What does he mean by agents? He says any agents, the number of any agents. So to me, that means you could have a bunch of assassins in there, which is more than likely going to be the case, right? You could have a bunch of spies in there. You could have a bunch of bishops in there. You could have a bunch of emissaries, princesses, inquisitors, grand inquisitors, right? I think that covers all the bases. If so, awesome. And I would love for this to be true because it gives another value to those strategic agents, right? Like spies and assassins have a pretty clear value. Emissaries have a clear use, but after that use, they seem kind of pointless. Same thing with bishops or priest agents. You know, like religion is either really important in the game or it's really irrelevant. So, in other words, like either the religion is totally not working in your favor, or it's fine and you don't need a bishop there anymore, right? But if this is true, you could increase your chance to inherit a province by piling it with bishops. Then awesome, because bishops are immune to border forts. They're immune to spies, counter spies. They can be assassinated, but that's it. So that would be awesome if this was true. Moving on, though, because I'm not convinced yet of that one. This is the big one, and I wonder if this is the reason I inherited when playing as the Scots. Plus 50 points if the candidate owns any neighboring province. So when I was playing as the Scots, I did neighbor at least one province of the Northumbrians, but only one and maximum two, and I inherited 5. So that tells me that this does not need to be the case for all of the provinces you inherit, right? And what I'm wondering is if there's some kind of chain effect whereby, okay, the game calculated to determine if I inherit this province which I am adjacent to. It gives me the plus 50. Great, I get it. Now from this province, does that count as mine for the purposes of determining if it's adjacent to the next one, right? It really seems like everything went my way as the Scots when I inherited from the Northumbrians. But again, I'm not totally sure. But 50 points is pretty huge. Again, you need 40 to inherit a province. So what this suggests is you would have the best luck of trying to inherit a province from a faction that you border, which is not impossible to arrange. You can certainly border other factions and live at peace with them, even on expert, if you play a peaceful campaign where you're not attacking very much, you're not growing your empire very large. So it's possible to maintain peaceful borders. So that's going to be one thing that I really try to work on. Because thinking about my Spanish campaign, I don't believe there were too many occasions where I actually bordered a faction that I was trying to inherit from. There was one, that was the Aragonese, and that, I think the marriage was conducted a long time before, so that may not have been enough. And I think I eliminated the entire factions. Anyway, we'll get into some of these other factors, but bordering seems to be really try to border the faction you want to inherit from. All right, this is fascinating to me. Minus 100 points if you're at war with the faction that you're trying to inherit. This says that it's not impossible to inherit if you're at war with a faction. It's just a lot harder. So you could get minus 100 points for being at war with a faction, but pile a ton of agents in there and you can easily overcome that, right? 10 bishops or 10 emissaries is enough to completely counter this negative 100 if this is all correct. So, needless to say, I'm going to try not to be at war with factions if I'm going to inherit. But this says that it is possible. It's harder, but it is possible. Notice too what's not here. Nothing about plus 100 if they're allied, right? Nothing about plus 0 if they're neutral. So again, this gave me a little bit of hope when I first read it, because one thing that I had been wondering about was, do you need to be allied to the faction, to the target faction you're inheriting from? Do you need, therefore, the marriage to be the thing that makes you allied to them? And if that's the case, the only way to make that happen is to wait for the AI to send you a princess. Because when you request a princess to marry into your faction, that does not, even if they agree, that does not make you allied to that faction. You get the princess, your heir or your king or whoever is now married to her, but you are not allied with her faction. It's a little strange. But if it happens in reverse, they send you a princess, now you're allied. Same thing if you send your princess to another faction. If they agree, now you're allied, you lose the princess, right? So for a while I was thinking, okay, I need a marriage alliance, which means I need to wait for the princess to come to me. This is maybe suggesting that maybe you don't need to do that. Again, it doesn't say anything about needing to be allied. So, questions, right? Questions about that. Okay, minus also the number of years that have passed since the marriage. So, if you're going to try this, you want to track the years of the marriage and subtract that number of years from the time that you eliminate the faction. All right, the biggest thing that I think maybe is screwing people up is playing Glorious Achievements mode, because you get a penalty above and beyond the you can't inherit if you have the most glory points. Beyond that, you additionally have a penalty based on how many points you even have. So what this looks like to me is a formula where we take the average number of glory points of all the other factions, maybe including your own, I don't know, but I assumed not. I assume this is looking at all the other factions, and then you subtract the number of points that your faction has. All right, and then you multiply that number by 2. Now, a lot of times, you're going to have more points than the average. At least that's what I found once I started doing this. I did a quick Italian campaign. I think I tried a quick English campaign. And I found that, yeah, okay, I've got like, 24 glorious achievements points. And, you got to add them all up and divide by how many factions there are. And the average was like 26 or so. So, okay, that's another penalty. So that means there's a negative, let's say that they've got, I've got 2 more points than they do, right? So that means -2 times 2 would be -4, okay? So that means that's a negative 4 points to me trying to inherit a particular province or all provinces from that faction. That's not huge. Again, it's easily surmountable by even just a single agent most of the time. But if you're doing really well, if you're winning or even close to winning compared to a lot of the other factions, then that is really going to hamper you. So something to keep in mind. Probably the easiest way to do this is to play a conquest campaign or play Viking Invasion, because there's no glorious achievements there and you can just ignore this criteria. Okay, so if we do that, what criteria do we have to sum up? Let's make it easy for us and say we're not playing glorious achievements. We're playing on the Viking Invasion map, or we're just playing a good old conquest campaign. We want to inherit. What do we have to worry about? Well, how many years did you own the province? Okay, maybe forget that, because if you're playing an inheritance campaign, you're probably playing fairly peaceful, and you're probably not losing provinces anyway, right? So you're not going to be inheriting them back. So forget that. But let's say you can easily pile a bunch of agents in. You can try to inherit from a neighboring province. You can try to not be at war. And then, the years that pass since the marriage is going to be not really controllable. But here's the big question I have. You can, to some extent, assassinate and eliminate the faction as quickly as possible, right? Once you get a marriage, whichever way you get that marriage, you can queue up assassinations and get through an enemy faction within like 10 turns, let's say. It's possible to do that. Even much quicker than that, if you've got the assassins in place. But let's say that like you're having a hard time. You don't quite have the assassins in place yet. But let's say that the faction sent you a princess, and so now you're allied with them, but that was a long time ago, right? And now you've got all your assassins in place and you think they're kind of vulnerable, they're easier to take out. Maybe a king with a trait like resilient happened to die of old age finally, so now you can target his weaker heirs. What if, at this point, instead of relying on the old marriage claim from like 40 years ago, what if you request another princess to marry into your family? You don't wait. You send your emissary and drop it on one of their princesses. You're already allied. A lot of times, the AI will agree to that. Sometimes they won't, but you keep trying. Sometimes they'll say yes. That should, according to this, reset the date of the marriage and make it so that you have fewer points deducted here, right, in terms of the number of years that have passed since the marriage. But if the marriage does matter, and he doesn't say that it does, but if it really does matter, then you have no control over that. And in fact, if it needs to be a marriage offer from the other faction, I think you really can't control that, because you got to wait for the AI. Not only do you have to wait for the AI, which you can't control, but once you're allied with the AI, which you will be if you agree to the princess they send you, they will stop sending you princesses because they're already allied to you. They're not just going to send you a princess again, right? They do that as part of making an alliance. So, I don't know. He says that's not the way it works. So I've been trying tests going strictly by this, and it has not worked for me so far, even though I think I should have inherited. I had a ton of agents in the provinces. I requested a bunch of marriages, right? Like to make sure it wasn't that many years that went past. I wasn't winning in glorious achievements, yada, yada, all this kind of stuff. Anyway, I think that I'm kind of missing something here. So, finally, if the number of points is greater than 0, then greater than 40, then the candidate faction inherits the province. So you need 41 points, I guess. It's got to be greater than 40. So you need 41 points according to all of this. Then you inherit the province. I should be able to get that almost all the time by putting 5 bishops in a province, right? Again, assuming that I'm not at war and assuming that it's been not more than a year since we got a marriage. But let's say, okay, we get a marriage and a decade goes by. So that's just one more agent because each agent adds 10 points, right? Throw another bishop in there. It seems like that's all it would take. So it seems like, according to this should be happening a lot more frequently, right? It should have happened several times by now in the past few days I've been testing. It hasn't yet. So I may be misunderstanding something here. We'll see. Now, the parenthetical part took me a little while to understand. I'm not sure that I really do. But what this means is if the number of points is greater than 0 and no new leader has been chosen for HRE or Vikings. What do you mean no new leader has been chosen for HRE or Vikings? How can a new leader is chosen every time, right? I don't know what he means by this. One thought I had was that maybe this means a leader who's not an heir, but that's a weird way of saying it because when you kill all the royal family of the Holy Roman Empire, for example, you'll get a message that says something like, a new emperor has been elected. That's what this sounds like. So you'll never see no new leader being chosen unless the faction is completely conquered, in which case you won't inherit anything because they don't have any provinces left, right? So, I'm not sure about this. But given that it's about the HRE or the Vikings, maybe we can ignore it. Maybe it just means you wipe out the royal family for these particular factions. And maybe there's no one, and maybe you got rid of all the royal blood guys too, right? I don't know. Or maybe you're supposed to keep the royal blood guys around, but eliminate the princes and the king, right? Because you've got to eliminate the princes and the king to inherit. You make sure there's some guys of royal blood who are not princes, but like old uncles. And then instead of a leader being chosen, it's a new heir and a civil war erupts and you can inherit some of the leftovers, right? Maybe that's the situation. Anyway, probably easier to avoid this until we understand the mechanic better. So don't worry about the HRE. All right, otherwise, if the number of points is greater than -20, all right, again, I wonder if there's a mistake here. But there's a mistake in a couple of directions because there's something missing. First, I thought this must mean if the number of points is less than 20. So you've got above 40 or above 0 for the HRE and the Vikings, or less than 20. But what about the gap between 20 and 40? What about the gap below 20? All right. So I'm not sure about this. But if the number of points is, let's say that it's greater than -20, let's say that's exactly what it means. Or if the faction dies, if either of those two things hold, then the province goes to the rebels. Otherwise, it remains with the old owner. This took me a while to parse, and again, I'm not 100% on this. What does the faction dies mean? I think this means you've eliminated not only the princes and the king, but also all of the royal blood characters in the faction, so that there is no civil war, there is no quote-unquote heir that you will see popping up, and instead it becomes all rebels, right? I think this is what I've been seeing a lot of. So there was a point in the video I made about my Scottish inheritance where I think people were realizing, and I realized later, I left a big comment in the description of the video, where I realized belatedly that there was a royal blood guy kicking around in the Northumbrian family when I reloaded to look at how things were set up. And I realized, wow, okay, he must have died in a battle or something, because otherwise, right, I wouldn't have inherited. But maybe maybe that's exactly wrong. Maybe I only inherited because he was still alive. Because if he had been dead and I did kill all of the princes and the king, and if there was truly nobody of royal blood, what this makes it sound like is you get nothing. So in other words, if you are too diligent about wiping out the royal family and all of the members of royal blood, then you get nothing. This is what it sounds like. And again, I've said this a million times. I don't know if this is true. But I'm wondering now, because I've just tried a Welsh campaign. I just tried an Irish campaign really quick to just jump in and give this a shot. And I've tried a few times where I've eliminated a faction, deliberately leaving some royal blood uncles lying around. And that hasn't worked because it counts as an heir, right? Even though it doesn't tell you that when you go to assassinate the king for the last time. It tells you there's no heir, but then when you kill him, it says an heir took over, and that's one of the royal blood guys. So that hasn't worked for me yet. And going the other way definitely hasn't worked. When I assassinate all the royal blood guys, all of the princes, and the king, the faction just goes to rebels, and I get nothing. So, again, this seems like if you completely eliminate the faction, all the royal blood is gone, then you don't inherit. So what maybe we need to do is look for royal blood uncles that are going to be around so that the faction isn't eliminated so you can inherit from them. Right? I think that's what that means. But if you have few points, let's say less than 20 points or something, or greater than negative 20 but less than 40, right? If you have negative points, then you don't get it, right? Remaining with the old owner, the province remaining with the old owner is describing a situation where there is a royal blood uncle or some character left in the family who is not a prince, right? Who's not the king, obviously, but is going to continue the faction. And if you have very few points in this system, then you're not going to get the province, right? It's going to stick with the faction you're trying to inherit from. All right, now comes the big problem. The biggest, most annoying problem here, and the one that I have been working around for the past several days. Unfortunately, there is a bug that makes it unlikely that this will ever happen. If the player enters the menu by pressing escape, the marriage dates will be reset. Therefore, the only chance is to never leave the game. But this is hardly possible. There are a couple of other bugs, but that's not so important anymore. Okay. So in other words, in my Spanish campaign, there were several times where I, got a marriage and then said, okay, this is a testing campaign. I'm going to save my progress here so we can reload and try again. That screwed me up. That meant every time I did that, every time I escaped out and went to the menu to make a save for testing, that screwed me out of being able to inherit if this is true. If this bug is true, which I don't doubt, right? That would explain a lot of the randomness. I can totally see this happening, right? You can totally see this happening. Some stupid bug where something does not persist across saves. 100% I can see this. There's still stuff like that in Rome Total War. So many years later, happens all the time. So I find this totally plausible. And I have, in my testing in the past few days, when I'm telling you I tried an English campaign using these rules, I tried an Italian campaign, I tried an Irish, I tried a Welsh. That's with not escaping. And how I did it was, well, I recorded if I saved, and I said, okay, the marriages that I conducted before this point are invalid now, and they don't count. Now, the reason that didn't bother me too much was this makes it sound, the way he words this, as though you can never leave the game, but that's not true. In my Scots campaign where I did inherit, I didn't play that campaign in one sitting. I can guarantee you that. I played it over the course of several days. And I made saves, right? But when I actually inherited, what I did was I simply played through as soon as I got that marriage. The Northumbrians offered me a princess. I said, awesome. I took it. I didn't escape and save. I just got my assassins ready and went to work. And about 4 or 5 years later, I inherited. So it's not that you can never save the game. It's just that once you get a marriage, if you escape to go to the menu, you are going to lose that marriage, basically. So that basically means that I have a bunch of marriages that were just ruined by me, ruined by my own actions because of this bug. So that's very unfortunate, but it's not impossible to work around. Again, if you just recognize, okay, I got to quit the game. So that means I'm going to say, okay, I don't care about those marriages. We'll start over again, tomorrow or when I can play again. You can just say, all right, I'll play the first 10 years or so of a campaign, and I'll keep an eye out. If a princess is approaching me, I'll save before she gets to me so that I'll play again when I have a good, couple of hours or whatever, so I can do it without having to save in the middle. Anyway, this is very unfortunate. It's probably screwed up tons of people from being able to inherit. But if it's true and if we know that it exists, then we can work around it and it's not insurmountable. The problem that I've encountered, though, is that even following all of these tips here, even following all of these points, I've still not been able to inherit since. And so I got to think. I got to think that maybe there's a mistake in the idea that any marriage counts, right? Because I've been trying a lot of sending my emissary to request marriages for princesses, and that hasn't worked. Now, I have waited for princesses to come to me, and that's also not worked, but it could be, who knows, right? I think that there's some other criteria here. Maybe the agents thing is wrong. Maybe this is not meant to be a times 10. Maybe it's meant to be a times 1. Who knows? Maybe some of these points are simply typos here, or there's maybe some of these other bugs that he thinks are not so important are actually very important and would be good to know. I am not sure. Anyway, I thought I would share this information with you. I'm going to continue to test this, see if I can come up with anything. And if I get any results, I'll let you know. So apologies if you were enjoying the Spanish campaign and hoping to see something great. I don't think we were. Like I said, we got to a point where I had saved so much anyway, right? Like I played all of that without knowing about this. So assuming any of this is correct, I had screwed up a bunch of things anyway. But even without that, I stopped getting marriage offers and the factions dried up and it's the end game, right? So things are just a lot harder. What am I going to do in the future? Well, I don't know that I'm going to publish or, upload videos of me testing, because I think that's fairly boring viewing, quite honestly. And it takes me longer to test. I can fly through a bunch of turns when I don't have to talk about everything, right? So what I'm going to try to do is, probably, I still want to record some Medieval Total War campaigns, but we'll just do some normal campaigns, right? We'll just have some fun with it. We'll play like a normal person, play the battles, right? Try to win. But if it looks like I'm going to have any breakthroughs, what you may see is another video where I jump in and I say, okay, it's turn, 50, and this princess is coming at me, so let's give this a shot. And we'll see. I'd love to hear some comments from you, but I don't think I'm going to, quite frankly, because I don't think anybody knows how this works. I'd love to hear from Welder 2. If you or anyone you know is Welder 2, please get in touch with me so we can figure this out. This is my white whale now. This is my midlife crisis. I have to solve this. I'm going to stay alive until I solve it, right? That is the ridiculous Fëanorian oath I make. That is my curse and my burden to solve this issue. It's like in Rome Total War when I didn't know how protectorates work. And I watched someone get a protectorate and I figured out how it was done, and it gave my life meaning, right? So this is what we're going to do. But I'm not going to subject you to all of that testing. Anyway, let me know what you think. Check out the thread if you're interested. Don't DM Welder, although I kind of want everyone to see if we can get him to talk. I'm curious how he found all this stuff out. But I'll let you know if anything new comes up. Thanks. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care until then.